Hey everyone, I've got a designer showcase for you today featuring the Sunshine Crossbody Pouch from Bagstock. Like a lot of people, this was my first official bag pattern. This is the pattern that I see recommended probably more often than any other pattern for beginner sewists, and I tend to agree that this is a really good pattern for those that are starting out, but it's also a really fun pattern for people that are more experienced. Bagstock patterns are some of my favorite patterns, and I appreciate Namrata giving me permission to make this tutorial for her Sunshine pattern, and I'm really excited to be bringing this one to you today. So let's get going. Before we start, I'm assuming that you have cut and interfaced all of your pattern pieces according to the pattern instructions. I will make sure that the links for the different options for building your strap are included in the video description, whether you're going to do a webbing strap, a cotton strap, or a vinyl strap. And as such, I won't be demonstrating that in the video today. The first thing that we're going to do is build our exterior. Because once we have pieced together the exterior front pocket, we will be treating the center and side panels basically exactly the same way. We are going to start with the zipper pocket, and then we will follow the same steps to do the front and the back of the bag. So take two mirrored side pieces and set the other two aside. Your zipper pocket lining, your zipper, which is your shorter of your size 5 zippers, your zipper pull, and your split exterior piece. Set your back exterior piece to the side for now. Set your side panels aside for now too. The first thing that you're going to do is run double-sided tape along the upper edge of your lower exterior front section and the lower edge of your upper exterior front section. Take your zipper and you're going to fold it in half and mark your centers. You can mark those centers with a pen or by putting a small snip just at the very edge of your zipper tape. You're also going to mark the center top of this lower front section and the center bottom of the upper section. Take your zipper tape and determine if you have a preferred direction for your teeth to be pointing. I prefer it when the teeth point towards the left. Peel the backing off your double-sided tape and place the center marking, lining it up on top of the center marking on your lower section so that your zipper teeth are face down and pointing towards the bottom of the bag. Your zipper will overhang a little bit. So we have exterior front, zipper teeth face down, and then you're going to take your zipper pocket lining, place double-sided tape on both short edges, and once again, mark the center, then remove that double-sided tape and line up center mark with the center of your zipper and press that in place. If you're using a directional print, the print on your zipper pocket lining will go with the direction that is up facing towards you. Smooth that down, and what we now need to do is sew along this edge using a seam allowance of 5/16 of an inch. If you use 3/8 of an inch, then your center section is going to be too short when you're finished. If you use 1/4 of an inch, that's also fine. You would just have to trim it down to be the correct size when you're done. So I'm going to sew along here at 5/16 of an inch, sewing through my zipper pocket lining that is right sides down on the back of my zipper teeth, that is right sides down with the correct side of my lower front pocket section. Sewing through all 3 layers. Sewing down this edge using a 5/16 of an inch seam allowance, and I am sewing just between the angled edges of this lower section. Back stitching at the beginning and at the end. Trim your threads and then fold that lower section away from the zipper and press it down. This is the lower section of your bag. This is the pocket lining. I'm just going to press that exterior away from the zipper teeth, and then you're going to fold your lining underneath that front section. You're going to crease that on the back also to keep the lining away from your zipper. We're now going to top stitch along this lower edge. When we top stitch, we're top stitching through the exterior, the zipper tape, and the folded seam allowance of that lining. And I'm going to start my back stitching at the outside edge here and pivot to come along the front, pivot again to turn down the side here. Again, top stitching only on this exterior front section between the angled sides, because we will be trimming this when we have finished installing this pocket. I'm going to be top stitching using a longer stitch length, and I'm going to use a seam allowance of 1/8 of an inch. I've switched over to my Teflon foot, and I will be using this inside edge of my presser foot as a guide so I get a consistent seam allowance for my top stitching. I will be lining up the fold of my fabric with that edge, place my needle in the far left position as I sew along here, and that will give me a nice straight line. Back stitching in the side at the edge of that lower pocket piece, pivot, and sew straight down this edge. Pivot again, reposition your needle if you need to, and back stitch in the side seam at the other end. Trim those threads, then flip your pocket piece over, and then you're going to fold the other short edge of that pocket lining up to meet the upper raw edge of your zipper tape. Remove the backing from your double-sided tape and line up your center marks and press that down. And I also like to make sure that my pocket lining is nice and smooth. Flip it back over, take the upper piece of your exterior front, and you're going to line up the center marking at the bottom with that center of your zipper tape, and press that down also. And to double check that it is positioned correctly, you just can place your ruler or a similar straight edged object on top of the edge of your lower panel, and there should be an approximately equal amount of your upper piece at the outside. So if you look here, there is just a small triangle there, and I would like to have a similarly sized triangle on the other side. And that looks good, so I'm happy that my placement is correct. And now I'm going to sew at 5/16 of an inch along this edge of the zipper also, the same as we did on the lower section, sewing just within the angled top section, sewing through this exterior top piece, the zipper tape, and the lining panel. Sewing straight down this edge. I will be switching back to my zipper foot to sew that seam. What we're then going to do is fold that top section away, and you can press this with your seam roller or with your iron, and we're going to top stitch along the upper edge of the zipper the same way as we did on the lower half, sewing through the exterior section and this seam allowance where we have just sewn that zipper tape. The entire lining pocket is down out of the way. I'm going to switch back over to my other presser foot using a longer stitch length, back stitching at the side, and pivot to sew along this upper edge. Before I go any further, I like to take my exterior center back and just double check that the size is the same. If you find that your piece is too long, you can trim it down using the pattern piece. If you find that is too short, then you just need to consider that when you are finishing piecing together your front panel, that you want to use the height of your exterior side panels as opposed to your center panel, so that the difference in height can be hidden within your top and bottom seam allowances. What we now need to do is just baste this pocket. So we're going to go back over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch from this angled edge, sewing through the exterior, front, and the folded pocket lining. You want to make sure that it's nice and smooth underneath. You can even put some clips at the lower corner there to keep it in place. And you're just going to sew down this edge and this edge at 1/8 of an inch to baste that pocket lining to your exterior. Make sure you are sewing below your zipper, as we have not yet placed our zipper pull. I like to sew in the same direction, top to bottom, so that I don't cause my pocket to not lay flat. And when you come down towards the bottom of that pocket piece, it's okay if you are no longer sewing through the lining, as this will be within the seam allowance when we sew our side panels on. Before I trim these side sections down to line up with the edge of the front panel, I'm going to place my zipper pull. The reason that I am placing it before I trim that down is so that I have the extra zipper tape to work with. Before I separate my zipper, I'm going to take a look and see which side of the zipper teeth is sticking further out. And on this one, it is the right-hand side. So when I open out my zipper tape, I'm going to start by placing my pull on that right side. I'm going to pinch the zipper tape to hold the zipper teeth up against the side of the pull, and then slide the left side in to meet it. When I feel them touch on the inside of the zipper head, I'm going to slide the right side down and then push from the back of the pull and slide on that zipper. I will then check to make sure that the teeth are lined up the way that they started, with the right side further out, and then I know that my zipper pull is on correctly and that my teeth will be even and there won't be any bubbles. I'll make sure that I link my video on placing zipper pulls for you. We now need to trim the sides of this panel. Leaving your zipper pull in the middle, take your ruler and you're just going to place it from the top of that piece to the bottom of that piece, and we're just going to trim off this section right here. If your front section is not quite lining up because of the seam allowance when you did your zipper install, then use your pattern piece to get it as close to the finished size as possible. You may find that at the side here, there are some pieces that are a little further in or a little further out. So you want to get it as close to the size of this panel as you can. Trimming all those extra threads off at the same time. Our front section and our back section are now essentially the same. So the way that we sew the side panels on is the same, whether it's the section with the pocket or without the pocket. So take two mirrored side sections. The first thing that I like to do is draw in my seam allowance. The seam allowance for this section is 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to draw it just shy of 3/8 of an inch so that it will be a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which means that when I fold over this vinyl, my finished pattern piece will be the correct size because I'm accounting for the material used within the fold itself when I'm taking my seam allowance. Working with one side at a time, you need to place your panel right sides together with your exterior. You have the boxed corner cut out facing towards the center of the bag, and you're going to line up the edge of the outside section with the edge of your center section. However, when you line it up, you're not going to line it up so that the edges match here, nor are you going to line it up so that the centers match, because that will mean when you fold out your side section, you will have excess material at the bottom or at the top. And I can show you what I mean by that. If you sew along your seam allowance, lining up the edges here, when you fold open this section, you are not going to have an even line at the top and at the bottom. So what you need to do is line up the mark that we made that shows our seam allowance with the edge of your material, because we are joining these on an angle. So you want to have the line meeting up with the upper edge of your center section and clip that all the way down. And at the bottom, the line should also be meeting up with where the lower edge is. You will have a small section of your center panel that you can see at this lower corner, and at the top, a small section of your outside panel. We're going to sew along this edge using a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I am going to sew exactly on the line that I have just drawn, taking care as I go over my zipper. This is a nylon zipper, so I can sew over it. I'm sewing down this side using a shorter stitch length, back stitching at the beginning and at the end, sewing straight on that line that we have marked, knowing that that is my scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. My zipper pull is in the center, out of the way. I'm going to take it nice and slowly over the zipper teeth. If your machine has trouble, you can use a hump jumper there. Back stitch again at the bottom. I'm now going to place the second side panel the same way, making sure that I have the cutout facing towards the middle, lining up the line that we drew with the upper edge of my material, and clip that in place. Line up the bottom also. And then I will sew along this line as well using a scant 3/8 of an inch. And I'm going to do the same for the back panels. Sewing down here, and down the second side of the front panel, using a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance for all three of those sections. With those 4 exterior side panels sewn on, a couple of things I like to do before I top stitch is just check that the edges of my pocket piece have been caught in that seam. And then I like to check that my joins match. You want to have equal spacing between your exterior panels on your front and on your back. And when you're happy with that, take your scissors and we're just going to trim the corner of that seam allowance on all 4 seams. So we're going to be doing 8 total cuts. So the top and the bottom of each of the 4 side sections. And this is going to reduce the bulk in our top and bottom seams where we have the join between the outside and the center sections. Fold open your side panels and smooth them out. And you should have a nice straight line along the top. And ideally also along the bottom, particularly for your solid section. And you can press your exterior side panel away from your exterior center panel using a seam roller, so that it sits nice and smooth before we top stitch. Something else that I like to do is place a small amount of 1/8 of an inch double-sided tape at the very edge of that seam allowance so that it will be clear of where we're top stitching. Press that down, remove the backing, and then fold that exterior section over the seam allowance and press it down so that it stays nice and flat for when we're top stitching. Missed one corner there. What we then need to do is top stitch each of these side panels. I like to double check that my pieces match each other in size and also compare it to my lining piece from the pattern itself to make sure that I've got everything the correct size, and then I will top stitch. I'm going to top stitch back stitching in this upper seam allowance, sewing down here using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and a longer stitch length, then pivot again at the bottom, and I will do that on all 4 of those exterior side panels. If you're top stitching on vinyl, I recommend using a Teflon foot, and if you are not particularly confident in your top stitching, I suggest using a thread color that matches your exterior as opposed to a contrasting thread color. And then repeat that for the other 3 side sections. The next thing for us to do is to apply our stabilizer. So that is your fleece, your foam, or your Decaville. I am using fleece. This piece is cut to be the same size as my exterior. However, I prefer to keep my fleece outside of my seam allowance. So what I will be doing is trimming about 1/2 inch off the outside edges on both sides and the top and the bottom. And that will mean that my fleece is going to sit nicely inside of my seam allowance. By keeping my fleece out of my seam allowance, it will make my top zipper installation easier and it will stop my side and bottom seams from rolling. The other thing that we need to do is our boxed bottom correction. The reason that I'm doing it now is that I am going to fuse my fleece, and the fleece will also need to have the correction done. When we sew the side seam, if we leave this piece as it is with a 90-degree angle here, we won't have a flat base on our bag. When we go to box that corner, if we leave it as is here, when we fold open the bottom seam and the side seam, we will either have an excess area here, or we will have to push that center bottom seam up to meet the side, which will mean that the base of our bag will be sewn not at a 180-degree angle. So the bag will not sit flat when we place it down. So what we're going to do is straighten that out. If you would prefer not to cut your pattern piece, then you can correct it when you are sewing the bottom corner by making sure that the bottom of the bag, which is this section here, remains flat, and you sew straight across parallel to this line and ignore the kite-shaped part there. That is part of your side section of your bag. Rather than do that, I am going to make the correction, and I will show you how, and I will also link my video that goes into detail the reason why we need to do this. You'll need a quilting ruler or quilting square and a pen, as well as scissors or a rotary cutter. And you just need to line up the straight side of your ruler or your square with the side seam of your bag to make this angle here this angle here 90 degrees. When we sew the second side, the two corners will come together to form the base of the bag. If the base is not 180 degrees, which is the value of a straight angle, then the bag will not sit flat. So when you place them side by side, if you imagine that this is the surface that your bag is sitting on, for it to be straight, you have to have a 90-degree angle here and here. This angle here is an acute angle, so that will cause your bag to not sit flat. It will tip to one side. So we're just going to trim that section off, and we're going to trim it off each of the 4 exterior corners, each of the 4 lining corners, as well as on our fleece. So I'm going to trim those 4. I'm going to trim my fleece. You want the straight side of your ruler lined up exactly with your side seam. The side seam is a straight line. So you want the straight side of your bag and the straight bottom of your bag. That's the 90-degree angle if it's 3D. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the lining pieces. Straight side seam and a straight bottom seam so that it will sit straight when it is finished being all sewn together. And just cut that section straight off. And then you won't get that bowing in the bottom of your bag anymore. And you can see that once it's been trimmed, it sits nice and flat. Just for comparison, where I've trimmed here, this is what will be the base of the bag. This is the side seam. So you can see this is where it has been trimmed so that it will be able to sit nice and flat. This is the section that we just need to cut off. Now that that correction has been made, I can fuse my fleece to my exterior. I'm just going to trim 1/2 inch off these sides, the top and the bottom, and also around my boxed corners. And then I can fuse that in place. The other option is to use a zigzag stitch to secure your stabilizer within the seam allowance, and that can also help with bulk. And if you are going to be fusing your stabilizer on after you have already installed your zipper, you just want to be careful that you don't get any scalding from the zipper pull. Some materials do not lend themselves well to fusing stabilizer. As you can see, once that's trimmed down, it will be out of my seam allowance. Just trim this side a little bit more. Another option for fusing as well is to place some light interfacing over the top of your stabilizer piece and fuse it within the seam allowance so that you don't risk any damage to your exterior material if you have something that you cannot put under any heat. So I'll go ahead and fuse my stabilizer to both the exterior front and the exterior back. Once you've got your stabilizer fused or basted to your exterior, set those 2 panels aside and retrieve one of your lining pieces as well as your lining pocket pieces. I'm going to be using a facing for installing my pocket so that I don't have any raw zipper tape on the inside of my lining pocket. If you want to follow along with the instructions, then instead of using the facing for this first part, you would use one of your pocket lining pieces. I'm going to set those aside for the moment. And I'm going to lay my facing piece so that it is centered and 1 inch down from the upper edge of my lining panel. I'm going to use some painter's tape to secure that in place. And then I'm going to draw a line that is 2 inches down from this upper edge. Mark the center of your piece. And then I'm going to make a mark that is 3.5 inches out from that center line, which gives me a section that is 7 inches wide in the middle of my lining piece. We then need to create the box. We want our box to be 3/8 of an inch in height and 7 inches in width. I'm drawing a line parallel to the first line, 3 inches below. And I'll make sure that I extend that center line all the way to the marks that we made. And then I'm going to join those up, making sure that I am drawing my line so that it is perpendicular to the top of my lining piece. So now I have a rectangle drawn on that facing piece, and I probably could have placed this facing piece a little further down, but I have my rectangle that is drawn 7 inches wide, 3/8 of an inch tall in the center of my lining piece. I'm also going to draw a line directly down the center of this rectangle and then draw in my triangles that I will use when I am cutting the opening in that zipper pocket. Something that a lot of people struggle with when sewing this pocket opening is the puckering at the corner here. So what I'm going to do is show you a different way to sew this opening to reduce the puckering at the corner. The way that I usually like to do it is by sewing up to the corner, making sure that my needle hits right here, and then taking shorter stitches on the side, pivoting again at exactly that point, not going past and not being short of that point, and sewing along again this way. Because that is something that can be tricky, I am going to show you the alternative, which is just to sew a line across the top and the bottom and not sew your facing in place at the sides. Using a shorter stitch length, making sure that I am starting exactly at the point where we have started our rectangle. I'm going to back stitch to secure my stitches and then sew straight along that line. Slow down as I come up to the other end, back stitch again, and then rather than sew the side here, I'm just going to finish off my line of stitches, and then I'm going to sew the lower side the same way, starting exactly at the corner, back stitch, and sew straight down this end. Back stitch again. But I have not sewn these side sections here. Now we're going to cut this open and fold it out. Remove that positioning tape. And we're now going to carefully cut open this pocket on the line there. You can use scissors if you prefer not to use a rotary cutter. And you don't want to cut too small of a triangle, as you're going to need to use that to tuck your pocket facing out. So take your scissors and you're just going to snip carefully up to the point where we have started and stopped our line of stitches, not past the line that we drew at the end, cutting up as close as you can without snipping any of your threads. If we'd sewn the full rectangle, then this section here at the end would be closed, but because we haven't sewn it, it is actually open inside this little triangle here. So you just want to be mindful of that when you're sewing your pocket, that this piece here, inside there, is not sewn. So you don't want your little triangles to poke out. Trim your threads, and then we are going to turn that pocket facing through the opening that we just made. We're going to fold it out and we're going to press it away, rolling out that seam to get a nice crease. I like to use a facing that matches the interior of my bag so that if my seam is not perfect here, if it's not sitting quite flat, it is not as obvious as it would be if you had used a different color. You're going to press that with your iron or with a seam roller. I have this all pressed in place. Now something to consider is that where this little triangle is, as we mentioned, it is not sewn. There is a little tiny hole there. So you may want to secure these little triangles so that they don't poke back through out into your zipper opening. So what you can do is just sew a couple of stitches on those triangle pieces that would be sewing through the lining triangle, the facing triangle, and the facing piece itself, just to secure that in place so that it doesn't come out into your zipper pocket opening. Take your zipper tape and your pocket lining pieces. One of my pocket lining pieces is ever so slightly longer than the other, so that is going to create the back of my pocket, and you will also need your double-sided tape. Place double-sided tape along the upper edge of your back pocket lining piece. If yours are the same size, then it doesn't matter which is which, but if you're using a directional print, the tape will go at the top. Take your zipper, remove the backing from your back pocket lining piece, and lay the zipper down so that the raw edge of the zipper lines up with the upper edge of that pocket lining, with the zipper teeth facing up. You want the zipper teeth to be centered. Can help to move your zipper pull. That will help you to stick the zipper down without getting any waves in it. And I'm just going to baste along this upper edge at 1/8 of an inch to secure the zipper tape to my zipper pocket lining. When you've basted the first side in place, fold that open. Remove the backing from your second pocket lining piece. Line it up, making sure your edges are lined up. Press the zipper down onto that double-sided tape so that the long edge is flush with the upper edge of the lining pocket front piece. Press it down, move the zipper pull to make sure that it's straight. You're going to baste this side also. We now have a zipper tape basted to both parts of our lining zipper pocket with the zipper tape in the middle. You can choose if you want to have your zipper open from left to right or right to left. I prefer to have mine open from the left-hand side. Make sure that everything is neat. And the front of your pocket is likely going to be a little bit longer. Even though my back piece was longer, because of the width of the zipper tape, one of those lining pieces will be longer. So you can just trim that off to even those up. Take your double-sided tape and you're going to place it along the upper and lower edges of the zipper tape. I find sliding the pull out of the way will help me stick it down in a nice straight line. I'm using 1/8 of an inch double-sided tape. If you are able to sew through double-sided tape on your machine without any problems, you can use wider double-sided tape. Then working from the bottom first, remove the backing and you're going to center the opening over your zipper. Centering it left to right and up and down. You want to have about 1/8 of an inch below your zipper tape. And I like to just take my ruler and just place it on the side to just see if it is straight. When I'm happy with the placement on the bottom, peel the backing off the top of that zipper and press it down, starting in the center and working my way out. Making sure that the corners of my pocket opening are nice and square. Check the distance again and make sure it's nice and straight. Move the pull to the center to make sure that you've got the correct spacing at the open end also. And now we are going to sew that zipper in place. We are going to sew around the entire pocket. Because the pocket is open here on the inside, we can sew around the entire rectangle, and we will move our pull as we go so that we get a nice straight top stitching line. I'm going to be sewing at 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge of that zipper pocket opening. I'm going to be using a stitch length that is between what I like to use for my main construction and my top stitching, and I'm going to start at one of the corners with long tails, not back stitching, and sew around the entire rectangle. When I finish up, I will pull my tails through to the back and I will tie them off and tuck them between the lining and the pocket lining. You can start at whichever corner you like. Just make sure that your first stitch is 1/8 of an inch further back than the pocket opening itself so that it lines up with your final stitch when you come up the last short end. We are sewing through the lining, the seam allowance, where we've attached the facing itself, the zipper tape, and the zipper pocket lining. When you come up to your zipper, raise the presser foot, slide your pull out of the way so that you can keep sewing nice and straight. I will just position my zipper teeth inside here to make sure that they stay nicely opposed because the pull is not holding them together right now. Sewing up to the last corner, one stitch beyond, pivot, and sew down the short end. And then again along the long end underneath. Once I've got enough space, I will slide my zipper pull back up, turn it again, reposition if you need to keep a nice straight gap between your zipper and your lining. Pivot again and come up to where we started. Be careful of your zipper stops. If you are using a shorter zipper, you may need to remove the stops before you sew. Take that off and then pull your threads through to the inside. If you've missed any stitches or you haven't quite got the corner, then you can just manually sew the last stitch there. I've just missed the exact corner, so I'm going to pop my needle in through the last hole, take my thread, pull it through to the front, hook it in right at the corner there. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other end. It's a little tricky to see with the dark thread on the dark lining. You want to try to get your stitches to hit right at the corner. And then when you have 4 threads all together on the back, you can tie them together. And then take a needle and just poke it through the zipper tape or the pocket lining. So it is coming between the pocket and your lining piece. Pull it through and then trim those threads. I like to trim them but leave about 1/2 inch so that it doesn't pull back through the hole. So that zipper is sewn in place. Now we need to close up the side of the pocket. We're going to leave the bottom of the pocket open for turning our bag. So you want to line up the edges of your pocket, smooth it out so it lines up. I'm just going to place a clip and then fold your lining piece to the side, and we're going to be sewing down this end. I have a little bit of double-sided tape here I'm just going to remove. So I need to sew the side of my pocket closed. I'm going to sew that with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance just straight down this side. Be careful that you don't sew into your zipper stubs. You can see my zipper end is right here, so I do not want to hit that. You can remove those if you like, just with a pair of pliers. Back stitching. And when I get to about 3/8 of an inch from the lower end, I'm going to back stitch. And then I'm going to turn, and I'm just going to sew about 1.5 inches along. And that is going to help me when I close up my pocket, but not cause too many problems when I am turning my bag out. So I've sewn straight down one side, and I've just turned and sewn about 1/2 inch in, so I can more easily close my pocket after we've birthed the bag. And now I'm going to sew the other side again at 3/8 of an inch from the outside edge, being careful not to hit my zipper ends. Back stitching, sewing from the top of the zipper tape all the way down, making sure I'm not sewing through my lining and that my pocket lining is flat. And when I'm about 3/8 of an inch from the end, back stitch, turn 90 degrees, and then sew about 1/2 inch into the bottom seam to help when I'm closing up that pocket. You can trim back the upper part of that facing if you like. And the other thing that I like to do is just fold up the bottom of my pocket lining to create a memory fold that will help when we close up the very bottom seam of that pocket. Set that finished lining piece aside and gather your D-ring connector pieces, as well as your top zipper and your zipper end tab. Take your zipper and put your zipper pull on. The same way as we did for the front zipper pocket, we're going to start from the side where the tooth was furthest out and slide on that zipper pull. Take your zipper end tab and you're going to fold it in half, and then fold the short ends to meet the crease in the center to create a double fold tab. You want your tab to be at least as wide as your zipper tape. I am going to be doing a zipper that has a 90-degree turn at one end and a tab at the other end, because when you install your zipper that way, you can open it up a lot wider than if you have tabs at both ends. You can do it with the 90-degree turn that you do before you set your zipper length, or you can use the butler method where you put the tab on first, sew in your zipper, and turn it when you get to the end of your bag. I'm going to show you doing the turn first. I find it's easiest if your zipper tape is straight to begin with, so I'm just going to straighten that up a little. So that's straight, and the way that I like to create my 90-degree fold is by folding the zipper tape straight in half and making a crease that is about 1/2 inch from the short end. It's also helpful to just singe the zipper there so that you don't get any fraying. Then separate your zipper out, fold it again where that crease is so that it's folded straight in half, and then you're going to take the zipper teeth here and bring that out so that the zipper teeth line up with that fold. I'm going to tuck it under, and then you have the fold here and the zipper teeth, and it is angled underneath. You can hold that in place with a clip, and then match the other side. Fold it in half where that crease is. Make sure that it lines up with the crease on the first side, and then take the zipper teeth, fold them out so that you have the fold here lined up with the zipper teeth that are turned. And again, hold it with a clip. And then you can either use your sewing machine to sew the fold to the zipper tape. You can use a lighter to melt the zipper tape and then press it down and it almost glues it in place. Or you can use a needle and thread and just hand baste the zipper turn. I have a needle and some doubled over thread with a knot tied at the end, and I'm just going to baste this folded over edge to the outside edge of my zipper just by doing a whip stitch around the edge. I'm just coming in about 1/8 of an inch. That will all be hidden within the seam allowance. You don't need very many stitches. It's just enough to hold that zipper turned out at the side. I do like to place a stitch right up near the zipper teeth. You can even wrap your thread around the very last couple of coils to really secure that 90-degree turn. You can tie a knot and repeat that on the other side. It doesn't have to be super neat, it just needs to be secure. But I will link videos with the other options for doing your 90-degree turn. So that is secured. It's not particularly neat, but it is secure and it is even. And now we're going to place the tab. We need to make sure that we have the correct length of our zipper tape. So take your exterior piece and you want to place your zipper tape so that there is a gap of about 5/8 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch, depending on the thickness of your material. If you've used thicker material, like if you have quite a thick vinyl, then probably 3/4 of an inch is going to be better. I'm going to use 5/16 of an inch, and you're just measuring in from the outside edge. And you want to have the same distance at the other end. And then you can shorten your zipper tape, melt the end again, double check that your pull is on, and grab your tab. Take your tab and you're going to wrap it around the closed end of your zipper. The open end is the end where we have turned. The zipper head is facing that way. You're going to wrap that around and just place a clip. And we're going to sew the tab to the end of the zipper. I'm going to sew in the line of the zipper itself first to backstitch, pivot, sew along this edge, and turn again and backstitch here so that all of my backstitching will be hidden within my seam allowance, but I know that my zipper tab will be nice and securely attached to my zipper tape. Sewing at 1/8 of an inch with a longer stitch length, backstitching at the side here, pivot, reposition my needle if I need to. Make sure that my zipper end is tucked up into the fold of that zipper tab. Pivot again, backstitch at this side. Take your 2 D-ring connector tabs and we're going to draw a line straight down the middle. You want your connector piece to be double the width of your hardware inner diameter. I am using 3/4 of an inch D-rings, so my tabs are 1.5 inches wide. We need to fold the long edges in to meet that line. You can secure that with double-sided tape, or you can just iron it. And I've also added an extra strip of stabilizer down the middle to further reinforce that tab. I'm going to place a strip of double-sided tape just over that center line. Then fold the long raw edges in to meet in the center. And then we're going to sew around both of these D-ring connectors using a longer stitch length and sewing at 1/8 of an inch, backstitching at one end, sewing all the way around, and backstitching again when we get back to our starting point. Sewing all the way around both of these D-ring connector tabs. And what I'll also do is take my D-ring, slide it on, and I'm just going to baste the open end with the D-ring tab folded over my D-ring. I'm going to sew at about 3/8 of an inch. Just to keep that D-ring in place. Do the same for the second one. Now that we've completed our exterior front, our lining pocket, our tabs, and our zipper, we can start building our bag. We're going to start by marking the centers of our exteriors and our linings. And we're also going to mark the center of our zipper tape, lining up the folded edge of our tab with our zipper teeth and marking the center at the fold. Set your linings aside for the moment and take your exterior panels. When you are choosing where to place your D-rings, you have a couple of options. You can choose to place them so that they will be in the side seam of your finished bag or in the top seam where your zipper is. I prefer to place mine in the top seam. I find that if you place them in the side, once you have weight in your bag, they tend to pull a little and it can stress the side seam of your bag. And I also prefer the profile of the bag when the D-ring connectors come out of the top. So that is what I'm going to do today. When you're placing your D-ring tabs at the top of your bag, you can choose to have them both on the one side or to stagger them. If you want to have them on the one side, you can choose the front or the back. Probably the back is going to be better. And you're going to position your tabs at either end, making sure that they are within where your zipper is. I like to place the D-ring so that it's just inside where my zipper tab is. And then you're going to baste it to your exterior. I prefer to have my D-ring sit as close to the bag as possible, but you have to make sure that you have enough room to install your zipper. So you don't want to have it so close that you can't sew past where that D-ring is. So I have about an inch here, and I would then baste that in place, making sure that the gap at the outside of that D-ring is the same on the left and the right, and that it is within where my zipper is. And then I would baste that in place. You're going to baste that in place before you install your zipper. I prefer to have my D-rings, one on the front and one on the back. To do that, you need to install them so that when your bag panels are facing you, they are on the same side. Because once we build the bag, it's going to be like this. So you want to make sure that you're basting them to the same side. I prefer to have my front D-ring at the back end of my zipper. So I want to have the left side where my zipper opening is free of the D-ring. So when it's finished, it will look like this. This is the front of my bag with a D-ring here, the zipper in the middle, and this is the back of my bag where my other D-ring will be. I like to place my panels together and then using my zipper tape to guide me, I will position my D-ring. So the same way as I showed you for when it was on the front, I like to have my D-ring sit just inside of where my zipper tab is and about an inch hanging over. So that is the approximate position of my first D-ring. I'm just going to clip that in place. And then I'm going to lay my other exterior piece on the top and match it up. My D-ring is sitting about 1 3/8 of an inch from the folded edge here, and it is overhanging my exterior by about an inch. I'm going to baste that in place at about 1/8 of an inch, so it will be within my top seam allowance. I'm going to do that for both of those D-rings before I'm doing anything with my zipper. I've got those D-rings basted in place. Before we go any further, I want to demonstrate an optional step for you. Something that you can do to add a little bit more structure to your base of your bag is to place a piece of heavy stabilizer in the bottom. I like to do that by sewing together the bottom seam of my bag before I install my top zipper. So what I'm going to do is line up the folds where I've joined my exteriors at the side and center panel. I'm also going to place clips at the side to help keep it in position. And then at the place where the folds are, I'm going to put a staple. My staple is on the exterior within the seam allowance to keep those folds lined up. Same at the other join. And then I'm going to sew just this bottom seam at 3/8 of an inch. Trim those threads and remove the staples. You can also reduce your bulk at the corner there by just placing a small snip at the corner, just cutting that little triangle off. Then fold open your exterior. I like to check that everything's lined up nicely. Then I'm going to press open that seam allowance. You can use some double-sided tape to help that lay flat. Then take a piece of heavy stabilizer. I have a piece of Peltex that is 9 3/4 long and 2.5 inches wide. I'm just going to draw a line down the middle of that piece. Take your stabilizer piece and you want to place it so that the central line is over the top of the join in the bottom of your bag and that you have an equal gap on either side. You don't want this stabilizer to get in the way of your side or bottom seams. We then need to secure that to our bag. You have a couple of options. You can spray baste that in place and then you can sew on either side of that center seam, top stitching your seam allowance and at the same time securing your stabilizer to the bottom of your bag. You can fuse it directly to your bag if you have a material that can withstand the heat, or you can use a piece of stabilizer and adhere that over the top and secure it just around the edges so that that centerpiece doesn't shift. I'm going to adhere mine by fusing this woven interfacing over the top of my piece of stabilizer. The reason that I have done it that way rather than adhering the Peltex directly to the fleece is that I need a lower heat setting in order to fuse my woven interfacing than I would need to get a secure attachment of the Peltex to my fleece. So I've fused it just at the sides here, and now I am going to top stitch this center bottom seam. I am going to sew down one side at 1/8 of an inch, pivot and come up the other side, and that's going to further secure that base stabilizer to the exterior of my bag. Because I'm sewing through the extra layer with the Peltex there, I'm going to increase the tension as I'm sewing. You may need a hump jumper as you come up to the bulk of the Peltex, especially where you have the fold of your exterior side panel. Because I already have my two exterior sections joined together, it is going to make top stitching my zipper a little bit trickier. Because of that, I am going to sew it in such a way that when I am top stitching within a tube, when my bag is like this, I am doing it from the open end. Because of that, I'm going to start my zipper install on the back, which is the opposite of the way that I would usually do it. Take your double-sided tape and you're going to run a strip along the upper edge of your exterior back, your exterior front, and both of your linings. I like to have my zipper pocket at the back of my bag, so this is the lining piece that I'm working with first. Making sure that you're at the back of your bag, remove the double-sided tape, and place your zipper so that it is right sides down on your exterior, lining up the center mark. And at the moment, my zipper head is to the right. You want the space between the zipper tab and the turned zipper teeth to be approximately even. Press that down. You can baste that in place if you like. Because I'm using the double-sided tape, I am not going to worry about basting the zipper to the exterior first. Take your lining and you're placing the lining right sides down on the wrong side of your zipper, matching up the outside edges and the center mark and pressing that in place. So we have our back lining piece, the exterior back of our bag, and sandwiched between those two is our zipper tape with the teeth face down on our exterior and the zipper pull to the right hand side. And we're going to sew along this upper edge from one end all the way to the other. I am going to use a seam allowance of 5/16 of an inch. That is my preferred zipper seam allowance. If you prefer 1/4 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch, it won't affect the finished product. You can go with whichever seam allowance you prefer. I'm going to have my hump jumper handy for when I come to the bulk of this D-ring here. And I'm going to make sure that I am sliding my zipper pull out of the way as I sew so that I can get a nice straight zipper installation. I am starting at the open end of my zipper, and because my D-ring connector tab is right here, I have already slid my zipper pull down to here, so my zipper is partially open to make it easier to sew that first section. One of the parts that gets tricky is when you first come up to the zipper teeth. You want to make sure that you backstitch at the beginning and take it nice and slowly. Use a hump jumper if you need to get over those zipper teeth. I also like to backstitch where the zipper teeth are, since that is a high stress point. Take care as you come over your D-ring connector, and as you come down off this D-ring connector, this is a place that you sometimes will get skipped stitches. You can use a hump jumper to catch your presser foot as it comes off. And another thing you can do is just use your stiletto to press your material around that D-ring so that it doesn't jump off and miss a stitch there or create a gap in the top seam of your bag. We've trimmed the bulk where we have joined our outside sections to our center section, but that is another part that you may struggle with sewing. I'm going to slide my zipper pull back up to the other end where we've already sewn to keep my zipper tape nice and straight. And I'm sewing with the lining side down because the lining is the thinner of my two materials, and that will help it feed through more evenly. Check that you're happy. If you find that your stitch line is not as straight as you would like it to be, then you can sew it again. Press the lining away from that zipper tape. Create a nice crease right here at the top. And then tuck the seam allowance where we have sewn the zipper tape to the exterior and the lining underneath the exterior, keeping the main part of the lining out of the way. We're just going to crease that here. You can also place some double-sided tape within the seam allowance of your exterior and press that down to hold it in place. And I'm now going to top stitch this fold here. I'm going to backstitch at the side, sew along here at 1/8 of an inch, and then backstitch again here. Generally, when I'm sewing, I prefer to install both sides of my zipper to the exterior and the lining and then top stitch at the same time. However, because I have my exterior as one single piece, when I attach the second side of my zipper like this, this is going to create a tube that I'm going to have to top stitch inside. If we hadn't sewn that yet, that would be able to fold right open, and it would be very easy to sew on either side of my zipper tape. Because I wanted to put that stabilizer in the bottom, I'm not going to be able to top stitch like that. To make it easier for myself, I have sewn the zipper on the back of my bag first, so I can top stitch this section here from the closed end to the open end when it is still flat. It's easier to top stitch in the tube when you have the open end this way because you only have a small section at the end where your bag is in a tight space. So I'm going to top stitch this section first, and then we will sew the other side of the zipper. It's my preference to not change out my settings or my presser feet more often than is necessary, but I know that I will have a much easier time top stitching this section now than I would if I did it after I had sewn the second side of the bag to the zipper. Making sure that my lining is flat out of the way. The seam allowance of my zipper and my exterior is to the left. I'm just smoothing the fold out as I go. I know that this is a bulkier part, so I will take it nice and slowly when I get to that point. Slide the zipper pull out of the way. Again, taking it nice and slowly. Coming up to the D-ring, there is a lot more bulk there too. If I need my hump jumper to either get up or down off that D-ring, I have it handy here. I've got enough space to sew past that D-ring. If you don't have enough space, switching to a zipper foot can help. Turn and back stitch in the side seam allowance. We have the first side top stitched, so now we can install the zipper to the other side of our bag. Flip your lining underneath and take the other side of your exterior and remove that double-sided tape. Line up the center mark with the center mark of your zipper and press that down. And different to the first side, because I have all of this bulk here of the exterior, I am going to first baste the zipper tape to my exterior before I sandwich the zipper between the exterior and the lining. Before I do so, I just want to make sure that my zipper tape is positioned correctly. Make sure my side seams are lining up well. The center seams are correct. Make sure that it's lining up nicely. And then I'm just going to baste the zipper tape to my exterior at 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to make sure that I'm holding my exterior here. Because of all of the bulk and the base and the D-rings, it does want to pull away a bit. So adding a couple of clips, even though I've got the tape, can help keep that zipper in position so that it will be nice and straight when I sew it on. Just sewing straight down this edge. Take your other lining piece and you're going to sandwich the zipper tape, lining up the upper edge and the outside edges the same way as we did for the first side, and the center marking. Making sure to press that down around the bulk of the D-ring connector and your zipper ends. Press that down. And then we're going to sew along this edge using the same seam allowance as you used for the first side of your zipper. For me, that is 5/16 of an inch. If you used 1/4 or 3/8 of an inch, you're going to use the same seam allowance so you have a nice even spacing on either side of your zipper teeth. You can reinforce that seam also a little over where the D-ring connector tab is. Reach your hand inside and slide the zipper pull out of the way. And I like to pull the D-ring from the other side of the bag just up out of the way too, so that the zipper stays nice and lined up with the edge of my material. We've sewn the zipper to the other side of the bag. We're going to now press the lining away the same way as we did on the first side, and then we need to top stitch the other side of that zipper opening. The reason that it gets a little tricky is because we need to sew down here, and that is kind of hard to do when we have the zipper in the way because the bag is closed up at the bottom. What we're going to do is fold the seam allowance underneath the same way as we did for the first side. And press that down. The way that we're going to top stitch this section is by starting at one end, the same way as we did on the first side, and sewing along here as far as we can. When we come up to the closed in tunnel section, We're going to take long tails, take the bag off the machine, come around to the other side, and come through the tube section here and finish our top stitching from this side. So we're sewing through the exterior of the bag and the seam allowance of the zipper tape and the lining. Starting at the end, making sure that it is folded underneath, smoothed out as much as I can. This is a little fiddly. If you don't put the base in, then you don't need to sew the bottom of your bag before you install your zipper. So this part will just be as straightforward as it is in any of my regular pouch videos. But in order to place that stabilizer in the base, I needed to sew the base seam first, which just makes this part a little trickier, but having that extra stabilizer in your base really can elevate your finished product. So perhaps not something to do the first time that you make this bag, but as you get more experienced, it's a really nice way to give your bag that extra support at the base. So sewing down as far as I can, and I've just got this other side of the bag. I'm just going to pull it out of the way. Now it does make it kind of tricky to see what I'm doing. So I'm just folding it up. I'm going to go as far as I can. And then I will take long tails. Keep that D-ring smooth. That's going to be about it. So I'm going to raise my needle, pull it off the machine, pull those threads through to the back, and then fold it out this way. You can see the section that has not yet been top stitched here. I'm going to slide that under the presser foot. Make sure your foot is clear of your pedal right now. Slide the zipper out of the way. Fold it around. Make sure that that seam allowance is where it needs to be. Then come back up to where my last stitch was. And the same way as you would join your stitches if you had run out of your bobbin thread, we are going to place the needle in the last stitch hole. I'm just going to hand crank the first stitch, keep that D-ring flat, sew along here, make sure that it is nice and smooth underneath. Come up to the end, pivot and back stitch the same way as I would had I sewn all the way across. Take it off the machine, go back to that section, pull through the second lot of threads. Make sure I'm tugging the correct one. I'll know that I haven't missed a stitch if I have 2 threads in the middle and 1 on either side of the pair. And then I'm going to tie the 4 threads together. And because it's already on the inside of the bag, I don't need to tuck it, I can just trim. Make sure it's nice and secure. And then you can see where I've just restarted at the front here. Before we finish closing up the side seams of our bag, I want to offer you another option, and that is to place a rivet where your D-ring connector is. You can see here that your connector tab is well within the body of your bag, so you can place a rivet just below your top stitching line here to add further security to that D-ring so that it doesn't pull out. The way you would do that is just punch a hole through the layers, going through your exterior and the excess on your D-ring tab there, and set that rivet in place. And you would do the same on both sides of your bag. So you can mark that and punch your hole, centered below that D-ring tab, and you just want to make sure that you have enough space to set your rivet. And I'm going to place mine just below the bulk of my zipper seam allowance, so it's about 1/2 inch below the fold line. Maybe 7/16 of an inch below. I'm going to match it on the other side. Punching just through the exterior and that D-ring tab. Make sure that your lining is clear. Make sure that your rivet is long enough to go through all of those layers. I use 9mm rivets. These ones have a 10mm post. You want to make sure that when you poke your rivet through your layers, you can see the indent on the side of your post. Click the cap on, and then when you set the rivet, you should feel 2 clicks so that you know that it has been set securely. Now we can close up our lining. I like to start by lining up where my interior and my exterior meet. I place clips on either side of the joint, and then I will place a staple through the seam allowance on the exterior, just where the fold is, to keep those edges nicely lined up. I do the same at both ends. In order to get the lining to sit nicely inside of our exterior, we're going to have to taper our seam allowance. The lining piece for this particular pattern is the same size as the finished exterior piece. So if you were to put it directly inside using the same seam allowance the whole way around, it would be baggy inside of your finished bag. The instructions say to taper your seam allowance, so that is what we're going to do. I like to make sure that my lining piece is smaller than my exterior in all the dimensions of the bag. So because this bag has height, width, and depth, we need to adjust for the lining in those 3 dimensions. The way that we're going to do that is by starting at 3/8 of an inch at the top here and taper in to 5/8 of an inch at the bottom, the same on the other side, and that will reduce the width of our lining piece. To reduce the height of our lining piece, we will take a seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch along the bottom, and to reduce the depth, rather than box our corner using the same seam allowance at the side, we're going to use a smaller seam allowance. That may seem counterintuitive because generally a bigger seam allowance means you have a smaller bag, but when you are taking the depth, you are actually increasing your depth if you take a greater seam allowance. So on this corner, for example, the depth is created by sewing the seam here. This is the boxed corner. When I have sewn this seam, I have created a depth of 2.5 inches. If I sew with a greater seam allowance, the depth, even though it's only 1/8 of an inch, is actually 2 3/4 of an inch. So in order to have the boxed corner sit neatly inside of our exterior boxed corner, we need to make it smaller. I tend to like to have mine about 1/4 of an inch smaller. So in order to achieve that, rather than box this bottom corner with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, we are only going to use 1/2 an inch for the seam allowance. And that will create a box that is smaller than the box on the outside. When you're determining the box size on your bag, the finished depth is going to be determined by the size of the box that you cut and your seam allowance. Generally, when you box a corner, you're going to use the same seam allowance for your side and bottom seams as you will use for your boxed corner seams. So essentially, the depth of your bag will be determined by the size of your box cutout, and then you double it to get the finished size. So, for example, a 2-inch cutout is going to result in a 4-inch depth. If you have a larger seam allowance that creates a smaller box, but then you use a larger seam allowance to box your corner, you're going to end up with the same result. So if you have a 2-inch cutout and then you use a 1/2 inch seam allowance for your side seam, and then a 1/2 inch seam allowance to box your corner, you are going to end up with the same depth as you would if you had a 2-inch cutout and you used a 3/8 of an inch seam. So in order to make the depth actually less, you have to box your corner with a smaller seam allowance. So if you did your side seams with 1/2 an inch and then you boxed your corner with 3/8 of an inch, rather than ending up with a 4-inch depth, you would have a depth of 3 3/4 of an inch. So all of that to say, we are going to box our corner with 1/2 an inch, even though we have graduated to a side seam allowance of 5/8, and we've used 5/8 on the bottom. We're only going to use 1/2 an inch to box our corner so that it will nest nicely inside of our exterior. I am going to draw those seam allowances in, and I'm going to make sure that the first section is straight, not angled. The reason being that we have already squared up this side here for when we box our bottom. We're going to be turning the bag out through our pocket, so you don't need to leave an opening in the bottom of your bag, but if you prefer to turn your bag through your lining, then you can certainly go ahead and do that. Then I'm just going to graduate my seam allowance up to 3/8 of an inch at the top. And I have a section of about 1 1/4 inches at the bottom where it is still straight. When I'm sewing around my bag, I like to use a thread color that matches the exterior of my bag. So if there's any stress at the side seam, the stitches will be fairly well camouflaged in my exterior. So we're going to sew around the entire outside. The bottom is already sewn, so we're going to sew down here, 3/8 of an inch, back stitch at the join to reinforce that seam, sew along here, back stitch again, sew straight along the bottom, back stitching up here, reinforce, and then along this side. Use a hump jumper if you need to as you come up to the bulk. Pivot at the top there, come down. Make sure that your zipper pocket is open before you finish sewing all the way around. When you get close to the ends of your zipper, you may need to reposition your needle or even switch over to a zipper foot to get past the bulk. Remove your staples and trim any threads. And you can trim back your seam allowance as well if you wish. I'm going to trim back my seam allowance in just my lining. And I'm also just going to trim the corner of my exterior side seam to reduce any bulk. And now we're going to box our corners. When you fold open your side seam, the bottom should be nice and straight and lining up with your side seam. You can fold your side seam open or you can turn it to one side, and you want to match up the center seam on the side with the center of your bottom seam. I like to place clips at the angled side to help it sit nice and flat. You can use the staples again to position it if you like. And when we box the exterior corners, we are going to be boxing those at 3/8 of an inch. And when we box the linings, we're going to be boxing those at 1/2 an inch. When you're boxing up the corners, you will be sewing in a straight line parallel to the edge, which is sitting nice and flat. Back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Try to keep your seam allowance folded either to one side or butterflied open. Sewing straight down. You should not need to pivot at all when you are sewing this corner. You can sew a second line of stitches if you like to make sure that it's nice and straight, and then repeat for the other exterior corner and your 2 lining corners. When you sew the lining corner, remembering that you are using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then you can just check the depth of your lining by measuring that seam line. Make sure that it is smaller, and then you know that that lining will sit nicely inside. One more thing that you can do if you like is just pin your lining to your exterior so that it won't come up out of your bag. And you can do that by lining up the boxed corner on the same side. So I've got my exterior and my lining on the same side. You're going to match up the center seam, and we're just going to pin those right at the edge of the seam allowance, just at about 1/8 of an inch. By doing it at the edge of the seam allowance, there'll still be some movement possible, but the lining will not come up out of the bag. Lining up the seams in the center. There will be a gap on either side. Just sewing that lining to the exterior within the seam allowance of the box corner. What we now need to do is turn our bag out through that pocket opening. I like to put my hand inside of this side seam here and just fold that out. You can also put some double-sided tape in the seam allowance to help that sit nicely. And the corner where the zipper tab is, I'm just going to push on that seam allowance. I like to fold that one out too. Now take your lining of your zipper pocket and you're going to tuck that in. Where we have the memory fold, it should want to tuck over. Just going to snip the corner here at both sides. Then tuck that seam allowance in. You can use a point turner on that corner to help it sit a little more nicely, but that will get tucked back in, so it doesn't need to be perfectly poked out. Fold that in on itself and clip along the bottom edge. I'm just going to sew along this edge at 1/8 of an inch, back stitching at the beginning and at the end to close up the bottom of that lining pocket. I've gone with a webbing strap for my bag today. I will make sure that there are links to making the different types of straps, be that a cotton strap, vinyl strap, or a webbing strap, included in the video description so that you can make whichever strap it is that you prefer. And once you've got your strap ready, pop it on, and you're ready to go. And there you have it. You've got your finished Sunshine Crossbody bag. We've got large interior main compartment, nice snug lining pinned to the bottom. We've got our interior zipper pocket, our exterior zipper pocket. You can go with whatever type of strap you like. We've got a nice flat, sturdy bottom, no bowing at all. And this is just a really great pattern, really popular for a really good reason. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.